What's up, guys? So I want to talk about permissions in GraphQL. Now I have a GraphQL server in Node.js and I want to be able to tell if a user is authenticated, maybe if they're an admin or if they have some other privilege. I want to be able to check that before I go and fetch stuff in the database and do different actions. So I'm going to be showing you how to do that. Now I drew a lot of inspiration from this library called Apollo Resolvers, and there's actually a talk about it, and I'll link both of these in the description below. Now I'm not actually going to be using this library. Normally I would, just if there's a library already made for what I want to do, I'll use it. But I think it's a little bit bloated. There's a lot of things that you don't need in here, and it's going to end up being like maybe 10 lines of code to actually get the permissions set up to make this create resolver function, and we're going to do it very similar to how it is here. So yeah, but feel free to check out this library and check this out too. So I'm going to pop over here to the Node.js server I was talking about that has GraphQL set up already on it, and if you'd like to get this code, I'll put a link in the description below to GitHub so you can follow along and check it out too. So the first thing I want to do is go into my models, my user, and just add another field to kind of exemplify how permissions might work. So maybe I want to check if the person is an admin. So I have a field in my database called isAdmin, which is a Boolean type. And we'll just set a default value of false. And we just need to put a comma there. And perfect. So I'm just going to go over to command line real quick and drop my database and remake it. And we can stop the server for a second. So test, and then recreate it. That way it just creates that field. Test GraphQL database. Alright. Come back over here, just run npm start to start that back up. Alright, so now we're going to actually get into how permissions is actually going to work. So I'm just going to right click, create a new file called permissions.js. Now this is where I'm going to create that function I was talking about, create resolver, which we saw over there. And basically what we want to be able to do is, what I really love about this too is it's going to be super flexible, and you can also use this for a bunch of other things. Which we'll talk about soon. But what we want to do is we want to basically check if a user is authenticated, check if there's an admin before we run a regular resolver. So maybe before we, for example, I don't know, create a board, maybe you have to be authenticated. So before we actually create this board or run this resolver, we want to check if the user is authenticated, if there is a user associated with the account. So how would we go about doing that? And that's what this create resolver is going to do. Is it's going to run some code to basically check before, but it's going to do it in a super generic way. So we're going to create a function that takes a resolver, and it's going to return a resolver. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call this the base resolver. So we're gonna add some stuff to it in the middle, because our base resolver can create other resolvers, which, as you're about to see, this is going to get a little bit complicated. So we'll have a child resolver here, and this will be a function. So what we have here is, when we call this create resolver function, we're going to pass in a resolver. And then we want to be able to, with this resolver, create another resolver passing in a child resolver, so that this resolver runs before this resolver. So what we'll have is this, for example, create board, we'll have a is authenticated resolver that runs before the create board. That way this checks, sees if they're authenticated. If they are, comes and calls this child resolver. So what we'll do is we'll create a new resolver here, and it is going to take an async function, and it's going to take, this is the same parameters as our resolver. So, and we could pass more if we wanted to, but we're going to pass in the parent, or it's going to have 3 parameters: parent, args, and context, and we could add more if we wanted to. And what it's going to do here is it's first going to call resolver. It's going to wait for it, passing in the parent, args, and context. Then, like I said, it's going to return the child resolver. And again, you want to call parent, args, and context on the child resolver too. And then down here we return create resolver, and we pass in our new resolver. Okay, I know this code looks incredibly complicated, but using this is very simple, and it's going to be very intuitive. It's going to make sense, and it's going to be super flexible. So that's why it's really nice. But basically what this code is doing is it allows you can create a resolver, which that resolver can create another resolver. So it's a recursive function that we're creating here that can call other, we're going to create this base resolver, which then can create more resolvers, and so on. And cool thing about this is the outer resolver could return something. So maybe, and we could pass that as a function to our, or as a parameter to our child resolver if we wanted to. Now, I don't really have a use case for that right now, but that's something you could do in the future. Okay, so how do we actually use this thing? So we could create a is authenticated resolver, like I was saying. So what we'll do is we call create resolver, and we pass in our function parent args context, and then excuse me, we put in a resolver here. So we could check. We have the context, and one of the things that I'm passing in the context is if we go to just my right here to my GraphQL express route, you see in the context I'm passing the user if there is one. So I could just check if context.user. So if there's a user, good, right? We don't have to do anything. But if there's not a user, maybe we want to throw new error, not authenticated. That's nice. So what about if we want to check if they're an admin? Well, is admin. We can create another. So here's the thing. We could create a resolver, right, like that. Or what I could do is they don't only have to be an admin. We also want them to be authenticated. So we could say is authenticated dot create resolver, and then you pass in your function here args context. So now I can check if, and I can check context.user, and we know the user is going to exist because is authenticated runs first, and then we can check is admin. And you don't have to call this is authenticated. You could say requires auth. That kind of makes more sense. Requires admin. And then here, if they're not an admin, we'll throw new error. Requires admin access. And here, authentication required. Authentication required. And not authenticated is fine actually. Okay, so we have our two ones, requires auth and requires admin. You'll notice the difference between the two is requires admin actually uses this function to create the resolver. So what's going to happen is it's going to run this, then it's going to come here and run this, and then we could even create more, right? I could say requires admin dot create resolver, and then I could do some other check. I don't know what other check I'd want to do. Maybe you want to check if their username, if they're using maybe a banned username. So const band username check, and you could say context.user.username is equal to Don, then throw new error, bad username. Right? So it doesn't really matter what you have in here. You can do any logic you want. But what's going to happen is this resolver, what's going to happen is when this is called, requires auth is called, then requires admin is called, then this is called. And you'll see this when I do the example in a second here, exactly how that's working. Now I'm going to get rid of this. This is just a silly example. But these two are actually helpful. And now we're going to actually use these. So I'm going to export these. Oops. Export both these. So now in our resolvers we can actually import and use them. So import requires auth and requires admin. And this is from permissions. And I think I call it requires admin, right? Yeah, okay. So now any of the functions I would like to make this requirement on, I can, right? So create board, let's say. So it's this function here. I can just wrap it with requires auth. Wrap the whole thing. So just wrap the whole function in that. So now I can't try to create a board unless I'm authenticated. So let's test this out and show you guys it working in action. So mutation. So I'm not authenticated, right? Because to be authenticated, I am checking the headers and getting the token from the authorization header, which obviously is not going to be there because we're using GraphQL, and GraphQL you can't, at least the web browser, you can't set a token. So we're going to create a board and call the owner ABC and name whatever, right? And we're going to run this, failed to fetch. My apologies, guys. So requires auth here, we need to write create resolver. Okay. So now if we come back over here, run that, argument owner has invalid expected int found ABC. So console, well, that did not work at all. So let's come back to our permission. So our permission was not, is actually not working. So it looks like maybe context user is defined. So one other thing you can do to check is this. So if the user doesn't exist, or context.user.id, right? So sometimes they have an empty object passed, so you can check whether it has an ID. Because if it has an ID, the user definitely exists. So let's try that again. Same thing. All right, let's console this out. Console.log context. That way we can actually see what this value is. And I'm just going to log context. And then I'm actually going to restart the server and pipe everything to a file so we can see it, because this spits out a lot of stuff. So come back over here, run this again. Actually, it might not even be making it to the server. Expected type int the owner. Wait, why was owner expecting an int? That's weird. Create board. Oh, owner's an int. Just kidding, guys. I don't even think our mutation is getting called. Our resolver is getting called. Okay, there we go. So the problem was, you saw I was getting an error before. That was just because I was passing in the wrong value type to GraphQL, so GraphQL checks that. So we don't have to worry about this. Let me get rid of this. Okay, start the server back up, and let's continue. So you can notice how we got an error, not authenticated, right? Didn't let us. So you could put anything here to check whether the user, I think this is a decent check. You may or may not need this part depending on what your authentication setup looks like. Now let's show you if I am logged in, it actually works. So to do this, I'm going to create two users here. Username, I'm going to call this guy Bob. Email, doesn't really matter. Bob. Password, Bob. And oh, you know what? We need to come back over here to my schema. We need to add to register the ability to add an admin. Admin is a boolean. So now, if we refresh, it should let us say whether he's an admin or not. Admin, we're going to say false. And we're going to create another guy called Boba. And Boba here is an admin. Alright, conflict, because they have different use alias fields to fetch both. Oh, we need to set an alias. Oh, I forget how to do that. I think it's so okay, the problem is register and register both return the same thing. So you have to do a GraphQL alias, which I forget how you actually do. I haven't done this in a very long time. So it basically just renames it. Here we go. R1, and this is our register 2. Prettify, run. Was that not how you name it? Right comparison, oh, backwards. R2, so the name of what you want to call it, and then you do the function, it looks like. R1. Okay, so we created both these users. Now I'm going to log in with our first user, Bob. Login, email, Bob, password, Bob. Get our token here. Now I want to try creating a board authenticated and make sure that still works. So I'm going to have to use this program, which is a GraphQL desktop program. I'll put a link in the description below so you can use it too. What this allows us to do is actually add an authentication header. I forget, is it authentication or authorization? I checked the authorization header to grab the token, so I'll pass that in here. So now now it knows I'm Bob, so I can do a mutation and I can say create board owner 1 name, I don't know. So we create the board and bam, we get no error whatsoever. We try doing this over here, right? Not authenticated. So it does check the authentication, see if you're logged in. Now I want to also demo the other resolver. So I'm just gonna actually use the same. So you can add this to any of these mutations, right? I'm now going to show you how the admin one works. So now the admin one works. If we come back to the permission, it does checks if they're authenticated still. So even though we just did, check if they're an admin, not authenticated, right? Because it checks whether they're authenticated before it checks if they're an admin. But now if we run it over here, we should say not an admin, and bam. Since we just made create board that require admin access, it now says requires admin access because we're trying to create a board as Bob, and Bob is not an admin. But if we log in, so we're getting two different error messages. You notice that depending on how we are doing it. Here we're not authenticated, so we get the not authenticated. Over there we're not an admin. So pretty cool. So it chains down. So now I'm going to log in as Boba, so password. And we're going to set this auth header. And we are going to see if we can create a board or if we get an authentication error. Oh man, it reset here. Alright, theoretically, it should just go through because we are an admin. It's going to check that we're an admin. It's going to be like, hey, admins can do stuff, you're good to go. Alright, I don't know too. Alright, that did not work. So either Boba does not have admin access when we think it does, or our permission is not working. So I just want to make sure I was pasting the token. Okay, I am. Oh, okay. So here's the reason why it didn't work. I just realized what's happening. So when I create that token, I'm actually just I don't actually set. So this is going to be in resolvers. When I create the token, I only pass in the ID and the username field. I also need to pass in is an admin, and now it's going to work because we actually weren't telling whether they are an admin or not, so that's not good. So here, let's log in as this will be Boba, just to show you that Bob still can't create stuff. We'll log in as Bob too. Password Bob. Okay, so let's do Boba first. Now we create this new token. This new token should have admin access. So run it, bam, create the board, A-OK. Now everything is working. This guy, Bob, should not have admin access. And cool, we get our error. So that is it for this video, guys. A little bumpy. As you can see, permissions are, you gotta test them, make sure they're working. But I hope you can see how cool this method of creating permissions is. I can infinitely chain these permissions. I can create as many as I want. Or, you can mix things up, create different types, and it's really just running a piece of code before a resolver happens. So you can do, you can extend this to not just permissions, but other things. Maybe I want to do some logging, and maybe I'll just console log here every time and do, I don't know, log someone accessed a authenticated endpoint, right? So you could log that someone is doing that. So there's lots of different use cases for this. I highly recommend using this if you want to do basically change the permission, give access to different levels of resolvers in your GraphQL server. And of course, all this code is going up on GitHub, and I'll put the link in the description below so you can grab this, play with it, give it a try, and let me know if you have any trouble trying implementing this yourself, because as you saw, I had some errors when I was trying it. This is not the simplest lines of code, even though, like I said, it's only 10, 11 lines of code, and we created this whole beast. But it's easy to have errors with it. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video.